There are 16 tracks in Ballads of the Song of Solomon, but in this final behind the lyrics video, we're going to talk about the last two together. So we have Legends, Legacies, and Last Words, and the Parable. So Legends, Legacies, and Last Words is kind of like the epilogue. She says, love can be a war just to believe. It's no small thing when you can't see. It's hard. It's dark where I am, darling, and I have to lean on your heart and on your arm. And he responds, narrow is the road and difficult to find, but we'll be hand in hand at the finish line. I will be your seal, the last name on your mind, on your heart, and on your arm. So I'll pause there. The Lord said to Thomas, you believe because you see me, and you've touched me. But blessed are those who believe without seeing. That's hard. Love can be a war just to believe. That could be the most courageous thing you do between getting up in the morning and putting your head back on the pillow at night is just to believe. Don't quit, and you will win. Now, Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verses 5 through 7 says, who is this coming up out of the wilderness, leaning on her beloved? She said, I awakened you under the apple tree, and there your mother brought you forth. She says, set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is as strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, nor can the floods drown it. If a man would give for love all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly despised. You can't buy old wine. You have to let it mature. And it's worth it. It's worth the process. Proverbs 6:34, jealousy is a husband's fury, therefore he will not spare, he will not relent in the day of vengeance. And if you trace this motif of the day of vengeance through the scriptures, it's the day of the Lord, and he settles what he calls in Isaiah 34, the controversy of Zion. In the final verse here, for death is not the only one consuming all in view. Jealousy is a holy fury when it is set on you. In the day of reckoning, he will have everything. And then this last refrain, may the Lamb receive in me the reward of his suffering. And we're pulling this from the Moravians. If you're unfamiliar with the Moravians, Count Zinzendorf was a German nobleman who gave shelter to Moravian refugees who were spiritual children of Jan Hus, however you say his name, who was an early reformer. But if you've ever seen a refugee camp, we've seen them in Iraq and Kurdistan and, Syria, Lebanon. They are awful, awful conditions, and you're there for a long time. Like the UNHCR tents that are handed out they have a 6-month lifespan, and they know that. But families are forced to live in these tents for years, and all these stresses mount because it's miserable. You don't have things that you need for your children. And so, 18th century, you have a bunch of refugees living on this guy's land and tensions mount. And so he sought the Lord, like, what do we do? How do we keep this community safe from bickering and offense and bitterness? And the Lord gave him Leviticus 6:13, that the fire on the altar shall never go out. So not long after, the Lord moved in the midst of this community such that they refer to it like a Pentecost. And I think 2 weeks later, they started a 24/7 prayer meeting that lasted for 100 years. And when one thing I've desired of the Lord, that I would sit in his temple, behold his beauty, inquire of him. When you see the Lord, you cultivate a relationship with the Lord, he begins to share his burden with you. And I hope that through this song, you begin to see the priority that he has on his promises over Jerusalem in a way that would actually send you out into the nations of the earth, because that's the effect that it had on Paul, and that's the effect that it had on the Moravians. So in 1732, this is 5 years after this prayer meeting starts, 2 guys gained access to the island of St. Thomas in the Caribbean. So the story goes that they heard that the guy who owned this island had loaded it with a bunch of slaves. They're working for him, breaking their backs. Obviously, slavery is abhorrent. And this owner had said something like, nobody's ever going to preach the gospel on this island. Nobody's ever going to tell these slaves about Jesus. So the story goes that these 2 guys sold themselves into slavery to gain access. That's a little bit of like the fish getting bigger every time you tell the story about the fish you caught. But the point is that these 2 men left home to gain access to this island, and they did, and they were there for several years, and they bore faithful witness of Jesus and the gospel of the kingdom. And as they were sailing away from home to go to the Caribbean, They're in the back of the ship waving to their families who are weeping to say goodbye, because this isn't like today where you can just hop on planes when it's not a pandemic and come and go to and fro. This was pretty decisive, and nobody knew if they were coming back. And so they were waving to their families, and they said, "May the Lamb receive the reward of his suffering. May we be equally yoked. May we be a suitable, comparable helper." And so now we'll land with the parable. The parable is like the afterword, where we turn the lights on and literally say, let me say it clearly so you don't miss anything you heard. It in itself is pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to go line by line. I just encourage you to go pull up the lyric document with all the footnotes, test this out. But I want to submit to you that Romans 5 says that Adam in the garden, the man in the garden, was a type of him who was to come. And we look at Genesis 2 and 3, Genesis 3 in particular, and usually we go, oh man, everybody was like an idiot, pointing fingers at each other, and nobody could take responsibility. But I believe, I read this in Romans 5, and I was like, I don't understand, because Adam disobeyed, he died, he brought death. Jesus didn't. He didn't sin, he died, he brought life. How is this guy a type of him who was to come? And so I just went and sat Lord, help me out here. So test this out. But I believe that there is a whisper in Eden of the man and the bride, the bridegroom and the bride, and from his side, right, this helpmeet is formed. And I think that it's the poetry of the Lord that when Jesus was on the cross, he was stabbed in the side and blood and water rushed out. And that in this water of the word that washes us with the better word of the everlasting covenant and brings us in and invites us onto the narrow way out of lazy love into sincere maturity, into old wine, that it harkens back to Eden. I think this is why Paul in Ephesians 5 says, look, really, we're talking about a mystery here. I'm trying to give you guys marriage advice, and I hope that you follow it, but really, when we quote Genesis 2, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, therefore a man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, really it's a mystery, and we're speaking of Christ and his bride. And so we have to ask a lot of questions here. How is this a whisper of something to come? And I don't think it was as simplistic as the woman was naive and can't be trusted and, is manipulative and doesn't know how to read the Bible properly. And I also don't think that it's that Adam just didn't have a backbone and he was passive and can't be trusted and men need to be strong. And in the garden, we see the bride, who's never been lied to before, hear a lie and buys it. So she believed the lie and gave herself to disobedience. I'm not trying to sanctify or whitewash what they did. It was treason, and it brought death. For sure, it was disobedience. But I believe that when the Lord said to her, for example, there's a crime in the garden, the Lord confronts it, and then he says, Adam, what happened? And he goes, well, the woman you gave me ate the fruit and gave it to me, and I ate it. And then he turns to her and says, what have you done? She said, well, the serpent deceived me, and I took it and I ate it. All of that is true, and I think that if we simply see this as finger pointing and men are passive, spineless cowards, and women are manipulative and can't, they need to be governed, you have to chaperone them because they can't be trusted. I think we miss the gentleness in the Lord as he confronts sin and draws his kindness leads us to repentance. He pulls out a confession. Everything they said was true. This was the bone of his bone and the flesh of his flesh. And she ate of the fruit, and he knew she died. So again, I'm not trying to sanctify or whitewash this. I just know that when we do stupid things, we're usually not thinking. And I think it's important that when Peter denied the Lord, everybody, I'm sure, would have looked around, and Peter probably had a lot of what was I thinking? What were you thinking? Jesus had one question for him. Do you love me? And is the blood enough to cover you? And that's what we see in the garden, that I believe that there was a bride who died and a bridegroom who jumped in the grave after her. And in that way, he was a type of him who was to come. But Adam was just a man, and he was insufficient, and it was treason to lean on himself. Everything about this was disobedience, treason. I just think it's more complex than we have thought in the past. And Jesus can jump in the grave and pull you back out afterwards. The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king preparing a wedding for his son, and may we be a bridesmaid ready. Maranatha.